Greetings, I am Gaius Florius Aetius, Sacerdos of Apollon, and the following essay has the title Plutarch, Reconstructing a Greco-Roman Spirituality. Forward. The following essay is a sort of text archaeology, and it is mainly working on Plutarch's 4 writings published in his Moralia, called On Isis and Osiris, The Decay of the Oracles, Why the Oracles No Longer Speak in Rhymes, and The E of Delphi. Initially I was just reading them in my complete works of Plutarch's Moralia, but at the time I realized what an immense treasure these 4 writings are. They offer nothing less than the most detailed insight and speculation about Greco-Roman spirituality that exists. That there even is a Roman or Greco-Roman spirituality is something that to many still would be controversial, but the writings of the Moralia highlights this very clearly. One of the main problems of working on the text is that the 4 books never aim to reveal a coherent and complete system of spirituality, or different versions of spirituality, because the author assumes these are mainly known to the reader, since Plutarch was both a priest of Apollo in Delphi and initiated into various mystery schools, which apparently served as sources of spirituality. From the comments and the dialogues in some of the texts, we must assume all participants of these dialogues were initiated in the mystery schools, and looking at how much Plutarch assumes as given knowledge of his reader, we must further assume that many, if not the majority of the educated classes of Roman Greece at this time at least, were initiated in some mystery cults, at least at some level. This is an indirect conclusion, but I think it is very plausible, and that alone sheds a whole new light on the view of Roman religiosity of his time. We must, unlike the view of often held in the past, assume that the spiritual view, propagated through the mystery schools, was not a rare exception of the otherwise disinterested worldly Roman intelligentsia, but rather a commonly expected educational background. The writings clearly show that Plutarch knew that his readers had a reference of knowledge about spiritual and supernatural topics, all up to esoteric, occult, and hermetic concepts. Now, one thing that helped me see patterns which are otherwise lost to a regular historian is that I'm a member of a Hermetic order for about 30 years, based on the Kabbalistic and the Rosicrucian traditions, and after reading Plutarch's 4 books mentioned, I was astonished how many similarities exist between the spiritual teachings of the Hermetic tradition of the West and the concepts explained in these books from Plutarch. They go, in fact, so deep that I can no longer assume these are merely coincidental patterns of 2 sources coming to similar views. However, a regular Roman cultor who has no knowledge of these Hermetic traditions will have difficulties to see the patterns, nor will he know that all the basic concepts have an altered form, in fact been preserved in the teachings of Hermeticism, alchemy, astrology, and Kabbalah. For many Roman cultures, just claiming this will just sound like heresy. The concept that the Roman religion is an entirely hollow orthopraxis is such a widespread and strongly held concept that shaking it will likely find the greatest resistance, especially given the Hermetic school is heavily influenced by the Hebrew Kabbalah, which naturally will create quite a resistance against even considering that there are greatly overlapping spiritualities here. The main reason of this resistance and denial to even try to connect Greco-Roman religion with Hermetic teachings stems, in my opinion, from the traumatic destruction of the cult in the violent rise of Christianity, which seeded a deep enmity between polytheists and monotheists, and has since prevented all attempt to reconstruct a polytheist spirituality from comparison to those forms of spirituality which are usually connected to monotheism. namely the Rosicrucian Hermetic Orders and their use of the Kabbalah. Even I used to think of them as two largely disconnected systems. I just remind the listener that in Plutarch's double biographies on great Romans and Greeks, the author has interspersed many hints about religious practices and ideas. The longest part is in his writing on the life of King Numa Pompilius, the founder of the Roman Cultus, where Plutarch writes that Numa and the way he organized the cult and the temples was largely influenced by numerological and spiritual views of the Pythagoreans. Though the temple of Vesta has a flame in the center, symbolizing the sun but also the soul, the spirit, the inner flame, as a spiritual symbol, and the circular structure symbolizes the circular nature of eternal change. A motive that we find in the Moralia many times, the duality of matter and spirit, wherein matter is the ever-changing and spirit the eternal and unchanging, a view handed down from Pythagoras to Socrates and Plato, and the concepts of the eternal ideas, which in this light must be newly interpreted less as philosophy and more as spirituality or spiritual philosophy. Plutarch mentioned several times how important such geometrical and numerological ideas were of importance to King Numa and the early Roman cult. Plutarch describes a circulation that was held around the altar in the earliest times, symbolizing the circular nature of the cosmic order, a general spiritual concept that has been preserved through the millennia in the Hermetic orders, and from there went to the creation of Wicca. It was only when I began to read Plutarch at first, who frequently mentions elements of the Pythagorean teachings, that I began to doubt if that strong separation was truly not more than hindering our understanding. Plutarch expounds at length in many of his writings on the tremendous importance of the Pythagorean system of numerology, interpreting the world through numbers and geometric forms, the circle, the triangle, the square, the pyramid, and so forth. Any student of the Hermetic Kabbalah instantly recognizes the similar role numbers have there, and the more Plutarch explained the various numbers and their meaning, the more I found how similar they are. Not entirely identical, but the similarities are so clear that we must assume that the Pythagorean numerology and the Kabbalistic numerology came to existence by contact, influencing each other, or were created from a common source. Which of the two was the case can probably never be solved, though I personally presume a common source behind. We read from Pythagoras hints from Plutarch. He learned basics of his system from the Egyptians, and we know the Hebrew people, whose origin is more mysterious than common scholarly view assumes, is quite largely connected to the Egyptians. We also know the Chaldeans and Babylonians had concepts of numerology and so-called sacred geometry, and after reading Plutarch and comparing it with my knowledge of the Hermetic Kabbalah, I came to the conclusion that all these were just regional variants of one system of numerology, whose actual origin we may never know for sure. But it is clear to me that the scholarly view that the spiritual systems of the Greeks and the Hebrews are entirely disconnected things can no longer be assumed. As a merely side note, this could also open entirely new avenues on how Christianity was created, and how and why it was apparently so quickly accepted. Past series had always emphasized that polytheism and Christianity were like fire and water, incompatible opposites, where one worldview, the pagan one, was replaced by a totally different one, Christianity. This perspective is largely set into the world by Friedrich Nietzsche's writings about Christianity, which had a tremendous impact on the pagan view. After years of reading Cicero, Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, Plato, and Plutarch, I no longer see this stark contrast. But that would be a topic for an entirely different essay, and I shall leave it with this hint. Chapter 1. On Isis and Osiris, the Sacred Trinity. The book on Isis and Osiris is the largest of the 4 books I shall comment on. The books are written in a very complex manner. The author describes a whole plethora of myths, legends, historic events, and possible interpretations. In the later part, interpreting the meaning of Osiris and Isis and later on Horus, thus completing the idea of the sacred triad, he gives no clear indication what his own beliefs was. But given he spends more time on this topic than on most topics, we must assume the spiritual concept was of great personal importance to him. And we can assume it was not so alien to the Romans and Greeks of his time that he would not waste such a long text on the issue for just a very small audience. We know the idea of the Sacred Trinity exists both in Roman and Greek religion in variants, from Jupiter, Neptune, and Pluto, who are the kings of the 3 realms, to the various triads of the gods of Rome, like the Capitoline triad of Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva, and other such Roman triads. We know that this is a pattern all over the region. The Egyptians knew other triads besides Isis, Osiris, and Horus, and so did the Sumerians and Babylonians with Anu, Enki, and Enlil. Before I go into the text itself, I need to make again a comment about the role of the Kabbalah in this. The Kabbalah is today regarded as Jewish mysticism, though I believe the Kabbalah is more a remnant of the polytheist past of the Hebrew people. We can be quite certain, due to current historic research, that Yahweh was developed from a polytheist religion. He even used to have a wife, Asherah, once. In the Kabbalah, the Hebrew god Yahweh has a number of manifestations, which are in later times called his other names, like referring to different functions. But it seems clear to me that this overlapping between the polytheist and monotheist change the Hebrew religion was going through and the Numerology and Kabbalah were the last spiritual remains of the polytheist past of the Hebrews, which over the millennia the Jewish people try to forget or ignore. Isis, Osiris, and Horus are represented as a trinity, and here is a worldview related, although in the outer form, from the Egyptian religion, which is written in such a way that we must assume at least a very plausible spiritual view to the Roman reader of the time. Or so I assume. Plutarch actually wanted to demonstrate that the Egyptian spirituality is actually like theirs, which seems to me to be the actual purpose of the text. Plutarch is not showing something alien, some cultural customs and ideas which are strange to his audience. He writes as if the ideas behind the Trinity are familiar to the Romans of his time. He writes first on Osiris, and explains his principle of the pure spirit or mind. In this view, there is no such strong separation between the concepts of reason and spirituality, which is the main difference between the Hermetic view and the Greco-Roman spirituality. The Hebrew Kabbalistic view usually emphasizes this, that spiritual insights are not knowledgeable to reason, whereas the Greco-Roman view always indicates that the spiritual must also be comprehensible to reason. Though one with greater knowledge of the Greek original terms would have to look for the nuances of these terms. The fact that Osiris dies several times but always lives is interpreted that the soul, the spirit, lives on, untainted by any events of the material plane. So, Osiris is in this spiritual view not a god of the dead, but a god free of vices. Plutarch emphasizes the connection of virtue and spirit many times in the 4 books. Then Isis is described as Mother Nature, as matter, material world in the most harmonic sense, and also Isis as the sum or essence of all goddesses. She is earth, mother, maid, protector, healer, moon goddess, and connects all the various female deity qualities within her. It is said that the symbol of Osiris as pure spirit and male counterpart is the all-seeing eye, like the god Father is an all-seeing god, of which Plutarch writes, so that Osiris has the same role as Zeus Jupiter, who is also the all-seeing Father, represented in the syncretic god Serapis. Isis and Osiris thus form a duality of male spirit and female earth matter that strongly resembles the Chinese idea of yin and yang. Both are represented as counterparts, and like yin and yang, the male spirit principle is seen more as the ideal. The female material earth principle is not seen negative, but the male principle of the All-Father clearly is seen as the superior. In the entire 4 books, the spirit is always shown as to be the better, the perfect, since the spirit, like the gods, is the unchanging, whereas the material world is the ever-changing, and that is the lower world. This goes entirely against the theory of Friedrich Nietzsche, who claimed the spirit-world duality came into West through Christianity. Plutarch writes time and again that his view heralds back many centuries and is not merely a fashion of his time. He cites Plato and Pythagoras many times in the entire presentation, and it is written in a tone as one presents a well-known and for long established perspective, not as something exotic or new. The view that the spirit is male, superior, and the creative force, and that matter is the receiving, nurturing female principle, is reflected in the Hermetic order and large parts of the Kabbalah, where the female principle is the Shekinah. Chapter 2. Horus Apollon, the solar sun. The presentation of the third principle, however, was what was most fascinating to me, partially because I am a priest of Apollo, just as Plutarch was, but also because it sheds a whole new light on the spiritual view on Apollo. Plutarch identifies Horus with Apollo, and he does it so many times and so elaborate that it seems much more than just a fleeting usual Roman listing, like equating Roman gods with foreign gods. Plutarch had a very spiritual view on Apollo, whom he regards as a central god, not just as one among many, as the other 3 books referred here also reveal. Horus is the unification of spirit, Osiris, and matter, Isis. He represents the eternal change of the world, like an arbiter of change, of development, that puts a new dynamic into an otherwise steady element of matter and spirit. Horus is the prime mover of the world, in which he, like Apollo, is a sun god, representing the light itself. About this identity of Apollo and the sun I shall write in the following chapter when I deal with the other books. Plutarch claims the identification of Horus and Apollo goes back to Pythagoras, and Apollo Horus represents the oneness, the unity, the number one. So we have a triad where the upper forces of the spirit, Osiris, mix with the lower forces of matter, Isis, to create a third power, Horus Apollo the One, the light, the sun, which is the prime mover. Apollo Horus is thus a representative, or rather the representative of the All-Father Osiris Zeus himself. As Zeus Osiris governs as father of all things, so is the divine Son, who is also the Son, sort of first representative of the God Father. It resembles so much the Trinity of Father, Son and Holy Spirit from the Christian theology, and it is no surprise that we must assume today that the Holy Spirit originally was the Shekinah, the female face of God, also representing nature, as we know today from interpreting Gnostic writings. Plutarch writes at some length a numerological view on various numbers, which are largely identical to the Kabbalistic interpretation of numbers. But there is a fourth person involved, Typhon, the enemy of the gods, a god himself, god of chaos and disorder. Plutarch writes something very important, shedding a fascinating light on the role and view of evil in Greco-Roman spirituality. Typhon is destructive and evil in a sense. He is the power of disorder that tries to destroy the order and harmony of Isis and Osiris, of matter and spirit. But its powers are not that sort of evil that you just destroy or banish. They are the lower forces in disorder, but through taming and control can be used and must be incorporated. Plutarch tells of the myth how Hermes rips off the nerves of the slain Typhon and uses them to improve creation, thus symbolizing that the lower powers are not annihilated but put into their place. It is a teaching that is identical to the teaching of the Rosicrucian Hermetic and esoteric Kabbalistic law of the Hermetic orders. The great trump cards of the tarot reflect this knowledge in its images, and that is the true meaning of the text of alchemy as well. The tarot card, the chariot, shows this the most clear. The two horses represent the wild animalistic forces which the charioteer tames and controls, and thus moves the chariot. It is a spiritual view that has survived for millennia, and we can now see the Hermetic view is not a late addition born from Christianity. It actually dates back millennia before. Chapter 3, the E of Delphi, the 5 worlds. This book has two separate topics which are of interest here, Apollo and the 5 worlds. While also we get a plethora of legends, traditions, events which are presented, I shall focus on the spiritual elements of the revealed in the text. The title E or A refers to an expression that was used in Delphi, an expression Plutarch says to mean to be, or as an exclamation, exist. It seems to indicate Apollo has a central role of a creative god and a god of understanding. Again, Apollo is presented as sun god. And from the writing here as well as the other texts who debate the matter, the author highlights that the question of Apollo was the sun god or not. Still, people had different views about that at his time. But he writes that those who believe Apollo and the sun to be the same were the vast majority at his time. He says nothing if this had been so for a long time or it was a recent change. Apollo as sun stands for the number 1. Oneness, the unity of all things, as all gods are completely perfect beings. So, 1 is the divine number per se. As such, Apollo represents symbolically the idea of divinity itself. Plutarch regularly calls him the god, not in the sense to rule out other gods, but clearly emphasizing for him the personal elevated role. There are many interesting paragraphs about numerology, like number 2, the first even number, and all even numbers stand for the female, and all odd numbers stand for the male principle. He explains the superiority of the male odd numbers, that they always create something new. If you add 2 odd numbers, they create an even number, like 5 plus 5 equals 10. Whereas the female numbers only replicate themselves, like 2 plus 2 equals 4. So the female principle is nurturing, supportive, whereas the male principle is innovative and creative. This interpretation from numerology is almost entirely identical with the Hermetic and Kabbalistic interpretation of numbers in relation of matter versus spirit or male versus female. The union of the female 2 even and the male 3 odd create the number 5 in a form of marriage, 5 being the number of harmony. Hence there are 5 worlds, and this goes back to Plato. Here all systems are organized on 5 levels, like animal, man, hero, demon, god. Note that demons here are not the evil monsters the Christian mythology says in this context. I shall go back on the topic of demons later. There are also 5 forces in humanity, in each individual human. Vegetative force, perception, desire, disposition and thinking. When Plutarch goes on to describe the 5 worlds in such a way that we have 4 basic worlds and a 5th that serves as a sort of primum mobile, the formless origin or ether, and then there are 4 worlds of earth, water, air and fire. Now if you know anything about the Kabbalah, the description of the 4 worlds of Atzilut, Bria, Yassira and Asya, which are also related to the same 4 elements, show that the Pythagorean Platonic worldview is so similar to major elements of the Kabbalistic world structure that coincidence can be ruled out by now. Now the model is similar, like you have Earth, which is the world of humans, Earth in the third of the element Earth, which is similar to the Kabbalistic Atzilut, which is also the material world of mortals. The second world would be water, which is the world of the heroes or demigods, being half human, half god, which is similar to the Kabbalistic world of Bria, the world of angels. Then you have as the third element air, which is to the beings called demons or daimons, which are not to confuse with the Christian idea of a demon, which is similar to the Kabbalistic world of Yetzirah, the world of archangels. And finally you have the highest world, the world of the element fire, which in Platonic would be the world of the gods. In Kabbalistic, the world Asya, which translated is the divine names of God. Plutarch describes the 4 worlds as ever finer and more subtle worlds, exactly as the 4 realms of the Kabbalah are described. A hero or demigod is half god, half man, or maybe a sort of superman or overman, a figure like Heracles or Achilles. A word is now to say about the term demons. In the writing of Plutarch, they have a generally neutral connotation, though in the debate and the later text, The Decay of the Oracles, it is argued whether demons are always good and how they can sometimes be experienced as seemingly harmful, but their role is clearly defined as servants and helpers of the gods. So there is a great similarity between the role of an archangel, a spirit very close to the god, and as an archangel can get angry, so can the demon, which as now we will call daimon. The role is expounded in Plutarch's writing The Decay of the Oracle, where a group of people debate why there are so few oracles in their time, and within it the debate they agree on the view, while done under the blessing and guidance of the god Apollo, the everyday work of the oracles is done by local working daimon, and those daimons may move on, alter their will, if the people seem less worthy of their attention. Now, while a god like Apollo would always be willing to listen and would never be pity, the intermediate spirits are needed to tend the various oracle places, the daimons, and if over time the people of the area neglect their duties, the daimons may decide to cease their work in the region. This clearly gives the daimons a role like an archangel. and many of the people debating in text highlight that the gods are always good, and that the tales which indicate gods acting as to human are usually their daimons, servants of that god acting on their behalf, since a daimon still has some not entirely perfect and ideal characteristics which a god being perfect has not. Finally, one thing that is of importance that he mentions is that each human being can rise higher in level, or actually every being, by living a life of virtue. So a human can be reborn as hero or demigod, then live as a daimon, and finally rise to the divine. He would not probably become a god, but be close to the divine. Plutarch writes very clearly that these views were known already in the time of Plato and Pythagoras, and they clearly indicate the idea of an unending reincarnation. One may ask, how does this get together with the Greek mythology, stories like Homer on there is one life and the unending bleak realm of Hades? We have to assume that the stories of Homer, Hesiod and Ovid were much more for common entertainment, only retaining some archaic parables, but never had the function to serve as a literal view on the world, the same way that the biblical stories would be regarded as Christian. Also, we may assume there was a stark contrast between the religious views of rural simple farmers and the educated populace of the towns and cities. For a farmer without education, there was one life and then nothing to look forward for, while for the educated people of the cities, we must assume a much more refined spirituality. Both Plutarch and Cicero speak of reincarnation as something plausible. Cicero as a series of a few new lives to complete one's tasks, Plutarch is a never-ending series of eternal change and eternal new forms. A view, he says, which goes back to Plato and before. How many actually held this view is hard to say, but it clearly was more than a small niche view, and it also refutes this idea Greco-Roman pagans had a bleak view on the afterlife and no concept of a soul rising upward, but merely an ever-revolving circle where no ascent of the soul is possible. It is interesting to read that living a virtuous life is regarded as requirement for rising in level. I find this of the greatest importance because it gives us a vehicle to open more to the Roman and Greek polytheist than just doing the cultus, but a real outlook for personal spiritual growth and a rise to beyond the mortal world of man. Something I think would be very important to develop or integrate into modern polytheism, as apparently it was no alien element to the polytheists/pagans of the past. Chapter 4. The Decay of the Oracles. Apollo as sun god of central importance. The topic of Apollo and his special role is also begun in the previous books, but mostly emphasized here. As mentioned before, Plutarch emphasizes Apollo represents the idea of divinity per se, as oneness, or unity, the number one. Just a side note, I thought of hearing the term number one I remembered how it is the nickname of Commander Riker from Star Trek, the second in command on the Enterprise, so Captain Picard would be Zeus, if you allow me the Star Trek analogy that comes to my mind. Also, the book itself attributes the decay of the oracles mostly to the changing times. The seers are not as educated or pure as those of the past, and people ask mostly mundane questions now, but it also is attributed to the more changing nature of the daimons, the intermediates between gods and men. It is clearly said that the gods inspire the seer, give images to their mind, but the mind of the seer itself forges it usually into a specific expression. But that is not such a relevant topic for this essay. Apollo, as god of music, stands all for the harmony of the world and thus functions as a sort of main regulator. While he does not usurp the role of godfather Zeus, he clearly is described as the god-son in a central role. Here Plutarch mentions that all the people in the dialogue are initiated into mystery schools, which explains the concept of the daemons in greater detail, but it must be something he had to be silent about. Still, we do learn that the nature and maybe communication with that to learn of the nature and maybe communicate with the daemons was apparently an integral part of the mystery schools. So what they did was seemingly not limited to a passive exposure to rituals, but also complex teaching and maybe even occult and shamanistic techniques. The fact that Socrates claimed to have a personal daemon that would speak to him, something like a personal holy guardian angel, is quite revealing about how similar the role of the daemons were regarded to the teaching of the Hermetic orders of our time. The book goes on theorizing that there will likely exist more material worlds like this, and that our gods would manage them in maybe other forms, but still would be the same god. Again, there are also some paragraphs about numerology, like 1 is oneness, spirit, mind, the soul, gods, the divine, purity. 2 is duality, change, matter, the world, but also discord and struggle. 3 is structure and harmony. Now struggle, 2 chaos, and harmony, 3 order, form a balance with the number 5, which is the world number. Plutarch argues that the worlds penta, 5, and panta, all have the same root. The world is created through the number 5, with the number 10, 2 times 5, representing the completeness of all possibilities. All this, Plutarch writes, goes back to Plato. Finally, there is an interesting paragraph about why Apollo is identical with the sun, or in what way. He writes, Apollo is not identical with Sol, the sun, but Apollo and Sol are like soul and body. Apollo is the inner light, and the sun is the outer light, both standing for the ability to see. Apollo for the ability of the soul to see, Sol for the ability of the physical eyes to see. So Apollo is quasi the soul of the sun, and the sun is the outer form, as they are to be seen as the same, but in a way too different manifestation. Interesting is this duality, how the incorporeal soul or spirit seems to be imprisoned in the body. Like the rays of the sun are hindered by a fog, he says, so does the body limit the perception of the soul. The body is not so much defined as evil or sinful, but clearly a sort of hindrance, an ulterior system. That is why incorporeal daemons on the oracles see more clearly. Having no physical body, they have only few passions which distract their perception. In the oracles, a human being can clear his mind and open himself to the gods and the daemons, and learn to see with his soul's eyes in 2 ways. First, by living a virtuous and peaceful life, calming the excessive passions of the soul, which has a bit a Buddhistic ring to it, and on the other hand, through excessive enthusiasm induced by drugs, a quasi-shamanistic way of going into a trance. Afterword. I had filled many papers with handwritten notes working through these books, and it was a fascinating opening of a new perspective. After looking through my notes, I thought, oh, how much greater were the ancients than we even yet knew, where we yet just play like children with the knowledge. The restoration of the Greco-Roman, or generally speaking a classic era spirituality, will not be an easy task. What we have here are mere fragments, but I think they are enough to prove once and for all that the many spiritual systems around the Mediterranean Sea and the Levant area were connected and that the Hermetic traditions have preserved much more than we knew. The entire tone, the basic concepts are all so close to the perspective of the Hermetic law that it filled me with the greatest happiness, and myself being a member of such an order for 30 years, I feel like I haven't done it all so entirely wrong. The idea that the soul rises through reincarnations, and the chance to put Apollo in a central role of spiritual version of the Greco-Roman religion opens huge opportunities for an attractive spirituality. Such an essay can of course only grasp the basics, but for me it has opened a door. Things formerly seen as disconnected feel now being together like puzzle pieces. I regard this as a big opportunity to develop our Cultus Deorum Romanorum, and that is much less a reform. That's indeed a true restoration. Not one cut in half by looking only at the exoteric orthopraxis, as worthy as it is, but finally coming to terms. The Roman religion offers a deep, complex and personal spirituality.